Welcome. You are listening to a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast on Mental Health News Radio Network. Joining us, I'm Lorilee Binstock, host of a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast on Mental Health News Radio Network and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Today's guest is Dr. David Stevens, clinical psychologist, neuropsychologist, and consultant with extensive experience in brain function and mental health. Dr. Stevens is a former director of mental health for the 3 state prison systems. He currently provides brain restoration services to individuals. Dr. Stevens, thank you so much for joining me today.
You're welcome. So glad to be here.
You know, the brain is a very interesting organ, I guess. I feel like for as long as I've been alive, I'm 40, but I feel like we went from like not knowing anything about the brain to knowing a lot more than we have in just probably even the last 10 years that, I know they used to call it the black box, and I thought that was very interesting. But can you talk just basic, the brain's role in health and human function and in mental health, really?
Yes. So the brain has what I call 3 primary functions. First and most important is ensuring our immediate survival. So everything the brain does is geared toward making sure we make it through the next 15 to 20 minutes. Then its second priority is longer term survival. So the brain is, some people have called it a self-organizing system, which is very accurate, that it scans itself, it scans our bodies, determines what the need is in the moment and longer term, and makes adjustments accordingly. So the second priority, like I said, is longer term survival. And then its third priority is function. And the brain literally controls everything about us, everything in itself, everything in our bodies. And so the brain is in the moment making determinations about which functions need to be prioritized, which functions need more fuel, which we'll talk more about, and how to balance our immediate need. So it's really doing amazingly incredible things every second we're alive, including while we're sleeping.
It's really interesting because when I think of, when I think of The Body Keeps a Score by Bessel
Right.
van der Kolk, and how the body keeps the score, but I feel like the brain, I don't know if it's the brain tricking us or the brain just telling us what we need immediately, but can you explain a little bit about that? Because and when I think of like somatic experiencing and how the brain also kind of tries to help us, like you said, then for the next 20 minutes, like it's saying we need to survive and we need to be okay, right?
Right. So the brain does regulate all the micro functions. And what I call a micro function is really anything in the brain or again in the body that's at the cellular or tissue or organ or system level. So the brain scans everything about us continuously, and it uses that data to make decisions about, do I need to overregulate the autoimmune system? Do I need to focus on the cardiovascular system? Even down to things like, do I need to make sure the skin has enough moisture and isn't peeling or cracking? So the brain is making those kind of decisions continuously. And like Bessel van der Kolk, the body does keep the score, but the brain regulates all of that.
So I'm thinking, let's say I'm getting nervous and I'm getting, obviously, or I'm trying to think of a good example of how like the brain kind of, I guess if I'm becoming anxious, what is the brain doing when I'm becoming anxious and I need and I need to cope? How is the brain working at that moment?
Yes, and I'll preface that with, and this is something I say to trauma survivors, people that have experienced traumatic brain injury, a whole host of stressful, difficult situations, but you can trust yourself. And that's such an important thing. And included in that is you can trust what your brain's telling you. And so the brain, from the second it starts to lose fuel or glucose, which is what it needs to function, and needs our body and brains need glucose for us to stay alive. But from the first second there's a loss of glucose, that triggers small amounts, but still begins the process of anxiety, because that's the keeping us alive longer term function of the brain. The brain knows if our body loses glucose, if it loses glucose, ultimately that could kill us. So it begins to kind of sound the alarm, like something isn't quite right here. And that is what produces anxiety.
Very interesting. Um, well, I do want to go into your background. You've kind of consulted within the prison system, um, and so I kind of want to talk about that. You've worked with people who've been jailed. Is it um, what was your primary role and goal within that job?
Yes. So, primary role, I was the director of mental health for 3 state departments of correction. And then I've overseen mental health services in jails throughout the US. And now I do consulting, much more neuroscience focused. So, one of the things I do now is help um, design jails and prisons. So, the actual environment, the way it's constructed, the way it's designed, reduces stress, reduces um, anxiety and aggression for both people who are incarcerated as well as people who work there. And the environment, what's called the built environment, makes a tremendous difference in how people who are housed there or work there function. So that's really been my primary role. My goal, even before I started focusing on brain function almost exclusively, but was to help support people who had been traumatized. The literature says, and these are conservative numbers, but half or more of people who are incarcerated have experienced at least one, if not more, traumatic brain injuries. And probably, and again, the literature is a little conservative, but 60 to 70% of people who are incarcerated have experienced physical or sexual or emotional abuse. And so people who are incarcerated are trauma victims. And that has significantly affected their life and resulted in emotional dysregulation and also behavioral dysregulation. So, in my view, when the brain isn't functioning the way it should, that's when crime, that's when emotional problems, that's when mental illnesses, that's when substance abuse all arise.
Yeah, that sounds very conservative. I would think it was 100%, but obviously that's not where I work. Um,
Right.
but yeah, that I would think that it would be way higher than that. So
And it
then,
is, but that's what you see, that really where they get that data is people's response to questionnaires. So somebody's incarcerated, and right when they go into the jail or to the prison, they're interviewed and asked, have you ever experienced trauma? And now the correctional system is doing a better job of not just asking that question, which it's easy to say no to, but have you ever been pushed? Have you ever been choked? Have you ever been kicked? Have you ever been touched inappropriately? But even with those questions, it's kind of a hostile environment. And to ask somebody who's going into a prison or a jail to tell somebody they don't know important, intimate details of their life is a pretty big ask. And you're going to get a lot of what's called underreporting.
Yeah, I mean, when I think back, I'm a childhood sexual abuse survivor, and when I think about 10 years ago, I was the psych ward of a hospital, and I don't even think they asked me if I had been abused, but they asked me about my behaviors, and they misdiagnosed me with bipolar disorder.
Of course,
Um,
that's very common.
yes, little did I know that I was actually I suffered from trauma, and I didn't realize that until 10 years later, and I had been on lithium and all these other medications,
Mm,
and um so I can easily see how someone who is in a very difficult spot, being incarcerated, could easily just say no, everything's fine, or everything, something, I can see that being an issue with underreporting.
yeah.
Um,
And
so
even
what,
though, if I
oh,
can
go ahead.
interject for a second, but even though you're young, um, it hasn't been all that long that correctional systems and even mental hospitals have asked more specifically about trauma. So it doesn't surprise me that that didn't happen for you. Again, a relatively recent onset, probably in the last 10 to 15 years. But also, as you well know, what an incredible burden to have to deal with the effects of trauma. And then on top of that, be told you're mentally ill.
Yeah.
That is so, so difficult, such an incredible burden to bear.
Yeah, yeah, it was very surprising when I went into treatment, 10 years later, where they're like, no, you've experienced trauma. And
Right.
I'm like, sexual abuse is trauma? Like, I had no idea. I just didn't even know.
And how
So,
would you? If
right.
nobody told you, there's no way to know. And people talk about suffering in silence, and that's what happens so often.
Right. And unlike it now, 10 years ago, we weren't as openly talking about mental health as we
Right.
are now,
Right.
which I greatly appreciate, and that's what I'm here to do. So
Mhm.
that's my goal. Um, so as a neuropsychologist, how do you work with individuals who have been incarcerated? So some examples, because I feel like this is really fascinating to be, working with these individuals, and maybe there's a light bulb that goes off and they realize, oh, I've experienced trauma.
Mhm. So a bit of a complicated answer, but for like prison systems, I'm working with a prison system that has eliminated solitary confinement. And one of the things that we're doing with that system is when somebody commits a crime or breaks a rule within the prison, then they're assessed for what were the factors that contributed to that. And that assessment includes mental health issues and trauma issues and substance abuse issues and risk of violence and brain function and all those things. And from there, a program is designed to help them learn to manage and cope with the effects of traumatization, the effects of incarceration, and learning skills to better regulate their behavior, to better regulate their emotions. So on a big picture system scale, making sure that the actual needs are identified, that somebody's behavior isn't taken as, well, they're just a bad person or they're just trying to cause trouble. No, there's a reason why they did what they did. And ultimately, it comes down to brain function. So then, when I work with individuals, what I really focus on is getting the fuel to their brain restored. And when a brain
Mm.
is fully fueled, it will fully function. And that includes mentally, emotionally, cognitively, behaviorally, and even physically.
So that was my question, brain restoration, because that is what you do. So what is it exactly that you do? Is it like cognitive? Is it dialectal? Is it diet? How do we restore the brain?
Yeah, so first and foremost, um, glucose is the fuel for our bodies and our brains. If there's not enough glucose in your brain, you'll die. If there's
Is
not
that like
enough,
sugar? Is that
Yeah, but a specific kind of sugar.
okay?
It's what's called a monosaccharide, which means a simple sugar, which means it's chemically light enough to go across the blood brain barrier. And
Mm.
so other sugars like sucrose, which is in our foods and desserts and candy and all that stuff, that's chemically too heavy to cross the blood brain barrier. So it can't get to the brain to provide any fuel. So, and it, people don't know this, but the
Mhm.
brain glucose system and the body glucose system are two separate things. So I have people take glucose, which provides fuel to their brain, which when their brains get enough for long enough, it eliminates symptoms. So eliminates anxiety or depression or memory trouble or word finding problems or concentration problems or physical health problems, all of that. The brain ultimately is responsible for all of those things.
Wow. Wow. So we're not just going and saying, okay, we're going to restore the brain. We're going to eat a bunch of candy. This is
No,
like a
that doesn't work.
specific. This is a specific. I know because I was like, okay, glucose, sugar.
Right.
So I can be eating sugar, but that's not that isn't what we're
That
talking
won't
about.
help. Yeah, that won't help. But
So
you,
what is is it like the glucose that I had to take when I was pregnant kind of
yes,
thing?
yes,
Uh,
yeah. So glucose chemically is very simple. It's made up of 6 atoms of carbon, 12 atoms of hydrogen or water, and 6 atoms of oxygen. And that's all there is in it. There's nothing else. And so you can buy glucose tablets, for example, over the counter. You can also buy dextrose. Powdered dextrose and glucose are the same thing, but you can buy dextrose powder in small or large quantities and then take it directly. And when you do that, the majority of it does not go and stay in your stomach and enter your blood. It goes directly to your brain. And the exact mechanism, I would say, hasn't been proven yet, but it appears, I think it's likely, that it gets into your cerebral spinal fluid. And we know it gets to the brain within 3 to 5 seconds of taking it because of the effect on symptoms.
so what does that look like? Someone has been struggling mental health. Is there a measurement where you realize, okay, they don't have enough glucose in their system or in their brain?
Yes. So we could get an exact measurement by having somebody do a lumbar puncture or a spinal tap, but nobody wants to do that. So
No.
we can tell by symptoms. So overwhelmingly, headaches are caused by low brain glucose. Ear ringing is caused by low brain glucose. Lighter sound sensitivity is caused by low brain glucose. Depression and anxiety and obsessive thinking and not remembering things. All of those things are directly caused by low brain glucose. Because remember, the brain prioritizes immediate survival first, longer term survival second. So the brain is most interested in making sure all the major systems of our body are working. And then things like headaches or um, ear ringing, whatever, those are much less priority, but the brain eventually gets around to them. So, kind of an interesting example. I worked with a guy a while ago. He started having migraines when he was 9 years old every single day. And I met him when he was in his mid 60s. After about 3 months of taking glucose, he didn't have another migraine and still hasn't. And it's been a couple of years later. But he said to me one day, Doc, I think you're going to find this interesting. I had this split in my thumbnail. And I would go to doctors occasionally and they say, what's wrong? And they say, we don't know, but not dangerous. Don't worry about it. So he said, I just noticed that split in my thumbnail's gone. So even things like thumbnails, the brain regulates. and takes care of when it has enough fuel.
Wow, because I get migraines.
Yeah. Yeah.
I get headaches in the morning.
Hmm.
My daughter actually also gets migraines. She has migraine with aura. And now I'm thinking, like, do we need to take glucose? I mean, obviously,
Yes.
so, and is this something we can buy over the counter?
Yes. So you can buy glucose tablets, glucose gummies over the counter in the pharmacy section of any drugstore. And in bigger quantities, like I said, you can go online and just search dextrose powder, and that will come up, and you can buy it in 2 pound bags, 5 pound pouches, 10 pound tubs, and even 50 pound bags. And
Wow.
of course, the 50 pound bag is the most economical, but you can buy
Hmm.
it in any of those quantities, and it is just pure dextrose, which is what your brain and body need to function.
That is just so, it seems like such a simple solution that
It
I
is.
had not heard of.
Right.
Um, but I am curious, is there glucose when I like, sometimes, when we travel and we're in the mountains and we need to hydrate, we get like electrolytes. Is
Mhm.
that what's it? Is the glucose in that too?
There is some glucose or dextrose in electrolyte drinks, yes, but
Okay.
not very much. And our brains burn between 120 and 160 grams of glucose every day, just our brains. So the brain needs quite a bit just to maintain staying alive. And then it needs more for more complex functions.
Interesting. Is there any way that we could like overdo it, or it's just burning it constantly that if we follow the instructions on the label or whatever, we'll be fine?
Yeah, if you follow the instructions on the label, you won't get enough. You said at the beginning, people have looked at the brain as a black box. And even though nobody uses that term anymore, still the understanding of the macro brain functions is kind of like a black box. And people don't understand, even though if you ask somebody, does the brain control the body? Chances are they'll say yes, but they don't really understand the extent to which that's true. And so your brain needs more, like I said, than what the label says. Uh, I have
That's very
people,
fascinating.
when I first start working with them, I have them start off by taking 3 tablespoons at a time, 3 times a day. Or if they're taking tablets or gummies, 24 grams at a time, 3 times a day. And you cannot take enough to be harmful.
Wow. I I'm kind of like everything's like mind blowing. I
Right,
suffer from migraines monthly. And so
right.
I'm thinking like is this simple versus like me going to the doctor and asking for a medication that doesn't get covered by insurance that costs thousands of dollars.
Right. It is that simple, yes.
Wow.
Every single person I've ever worked with headaches or migraines, they go away as they take glucose.
Wow. And then it also works for anxiety and depression.
Right. Yes.
As simple as that. If we're dealing with anxiety and we're dealing with depression, we can it's just as simple enough. Just take some glucose and
Yes.
then we'll see how that works out. Um, and so you provide so that's part of, a supplement. Is there anything else that you do to work with cognitively, to help with people who are incarcerated, people who have struggled with mental health?
Yes. And that's a great question and an important question. So, one of the early things that happens when glucose is limited, and glucose gets limited to the brain with sympathetic nervous system or fight or flight system activations. But as glucose gets limited to the brain, one of the things the brain does is interpret that as something defective or broken in me as a person. So there's something wrong with me. And when I treat children and teenagers, simply taking glucose eliminates that perception of there's something wrong with me, or I'm
Mm,
broken, or I'm worthless. I really, really sad situation. I worked with a girl who was 3 years old who had been sexually abused.
mm,
And at 3 years old, she was already saying, I hate myself.
yeah.
And a couple of months of taking glucose, and that was all gone. But
Wow.
for late adolescents, early adults, developmentally, that's the time frame when we're deciding about our identity. And when the brain is low on glucose, it is telling the person there's something wrong with you. And as glucose lowers through traumatic experiences and concussions and head injuries, that gets more insistent. The brain says more and more, there's something wrong with you. And so then the person just decides, okay, yeah, there's something wrong with me. And so treating older adolescents through geriatrics, uh, part of the process needs to be helping the person understand that they're not defective. There's nothing deficient in them. They are, the words I use, they are infinitely worthy,
Mm.
100% acceptable. There's never been a person more worthy than any person, and never a person less worthy. And so getting the brain to automate that truth, that I am whole and complete, just as me, no matter what my behavior has been, that takes some practice and conversations and training.
That's it's so funny because that is exactly one of the things that I've had to work on, and it was probably the hardest thing to work on. As a childhood sexual abuse survivor, I've always felt unworthy. I've always felt like I'm not enough. And since I've started, healing and working and just moving along my journey, it's always that feeling of needing to feel worthy, needing to
Right.
feel enough. And I feel, and I was talking to my therapist last week, and I was saying, if I could just love, like, just radical self-love, if I
Yeah.
could just let myself know that I'm worthy and that I am enough and that I do enough, that I feel when I kind of tied that to all the things that I find difficult in my life, I feel like that small thing can help solve all of that,
Right.
right? It can help it would help me not feel sad about certain things, expect things from other people that, it's not their job. If I could do it myself, I feel like that can completely change the outlook. And while I'm working on this daily, um, and maybe I just need the glucose.
Well, you absolutely do need the glucose, because if your brain is not fully fueled, it will tell you subconsciously, but and then sometimes consciously, but that there's something wrong with you. And then
Mhm.
we go searching for, well, what is it that's wrong with me? And we look to our behavior, and we look to feedback from other people. And unfortunately, those two sources can confirm there's something bad about me, or there's something wrong with me. And so we decide, well, it must be XYZ, when in fact, ultimately, it's the brain not being fueled enough and continuing to tell me there's something wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh gosh, that's just, I just it's I talk to, trauma survivors, people who've done their own healing, but glucose is that's just the one thing I feel like, there's always this
Right,
thread where it's like,
right.
okay, yes, this is the thing that works, but glucose, I feel like is just seems like such a simple solution
It
that I
is.
haven't even talked about in the 6 seasons I've had the show.
Right. And I don't know why you would have talked about it. Just not very well known or understood.
Yeah, I mean, and then I think about like when I was pregnant and they had to do the glucose test and
Right.
and I was trying to like not I was trying to limit my sugar intake because
Right.
I just didn't want, but what I didn't know was, and I don't know, it seemed like a lot, but I remember being like, is there another way to do this? Because when I think of glucose, I think of sugar, and I think of sugar, I think it's not good,
Right.
right?
Right. That's the predominant message. And again, it's a lack of understanding of different kinds of sugar, and that the brain glucose system is different than the body glucose system.
Yeah. Yeah, my husband, when we were looking at, electrolytes to take to the mountains with us, I
Uh-huh.
remember, I was he, we really limit our sugar in the house. And
Mhm.
so I just remember being like, okay, well, I'll take the one that has the stevia or whatever,
Right.
which I don't even know is even great for you there. But he did say that he read somewhere like, oh, well, the liquid IV is better because I think he says the sugar is actually good to hydrate,
Right.
and I
Right.
just remember being like, is that true? And I believe you're just telling me all of this now. I totally didn't believe my husband though.
Apologize to your husband for
I
me.
will. I will. I'll be like, okay, yes, okay, we won't get the sugar-free
Yeah.
liquid IVs.
You may not want to go all the way to saying, honey, you were right, but you can at least apologize.
Right. Right, exactly. I have no shame in apologizing. That's one of the things that I've learned in my whole healing process. Um, but I feel like, we covered a lot of interesting things that I'm so glad we did because I just didn't know, and I really want to just, you know, once I get off the phone with you, run to the store and get some glucose because I feel like I do struggle with headaches and
Yeah.
migraines, and I'm
Yeah.
just always looking for a solution, and I feel like that is just such an easy solution. But
Yes.
I do want to ask before I run to the store and get some.
You can
is
pause for a moment if you like.
Yeah. Well, I do want to ask, is there anything else that you'd like to add? Because I feel like you are just such a wealth of information, and I just want to know if there is anything that you feel that our listeners and viewers should know.
Well, again, I think related to what I said earlier, trusting yourself is really a challenge for everybody. And particularly if you've survived trauma, physical, emotional, sexual abuse, concussions, traumatic brain injuries, uh, it becomes much more difficult. Again, like we've been talking about, because every sympathetic fight or flight activation results in permanent reduction of glucose to the brain. And the only way to solve that is to refuel your brain by taking glucose. But you can trust that as your brain is getting refueled, symptoms will go away. And that trust in yourself as being infinitely worthy, even regardless of your behavior. You know, I can sit in a cell with somebody on death row and say to them honestly and accurately, you are every bit as worthy as anyone else on the planet. You did things that were very harmful and destructive, and that's a horrible thing, and there's consequences to that. But that doesn't diminish you in any way. And the same applies to every single person. And
Oh, I love that.
as your brain is refueled and as you understand that nothing you've done has diminished you, the things that you've identified as, oh, well, this is probably one of the problems with me. There isn't a problem with you. There are functional problems due, again, to the brain not being fueled and being able to regulate everything. So we can clear up the functional problems, and people's understanding of themselves as whole and complete and acceptable can be restored.
Mm, that's beautiful. Yes. I mean, to have someone be able to say that, I think is such a gift,
Mhm.
especially someone who is on death row or someone who is incarcerated.
Right.
So
Or anybody else.
yeah, anybody else.
This guy on the corner, the school principal, the accountant, the grocery clerk, everybody. It applies equally to everybody.
I love that, and thank you for saying that, and
Yeah.
I will emphasize that, and to my children and our daily lives. So
Yes.
I'm so grateful that you came on and joined me, and I appreciate everything that you're doing just in the world. So thank you.
Thank you. And then a shameless plug. I have a new book out, which I don't know
Oh,
if the name,
yes.
but called Restored Hope, available on Amazon. So if people are interested in that, kind of
Amazing.
explains all the brain function things and the worthiness piece and things that are dehumanizing and then rehumanizing. So all of that.
Oh my gosh, yes, I'll put that in the show notes for people to purchase. And yeah, I'll plug it in the magazine so everybody knows that you have a book out, because I definitely want to check it out as well.
Great.
So, thank you. Well, that was Dr. David Stevens, clinical psychologist, neuropsychologist, and brain function consultant. For more information, visit restoredhumanity.com. You can also find that link in the show notes. I'll also put a link to the book in the show notes. March's issue of Authentic Insider is out. Check out Authentic Insider at traumasurvivorthriver.com. That's traumasurvivorthriver.com. You can also find past issues of Authentic Insider and past episodes of a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my email list. You can get Authentic Insider magazine in your inbox monthly. You've been listening to a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast on Mental Health News Radio Network. I'm Lorilee Binstock. Thank you so much for being a part of the conversation. See you next week. Take care.